Welcome. Come on in. Come on in. Hello, hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
What's new?
The European Soccer Championships are happening. It's
Following
fun.
closely, Connor?
Yes, I have a vested interest in this country performing well.
Yes, I know. I remember your flag.
Yeah, it made it to my next apartment and still somehow ended up in a place where it is captured by my Zoom.
And so are you missing big games by being in class this evening?
No, luckily because they're in Europe, it would be too late for them to be playing now.
Good. I would hate to compete with that.
Yeah. Don't worry, you'd be the number one choice.
Oh, thank you. That's great. That's good. What's going on with anybody else? Anything interesting, new, fun, exciting?
I'm debating on whether or not to travel to Croatia for 2 weeks while I have I have my second methods course after this. And
Okay.
it would be during that. I'm getting mixed advice. Some people are telling me I should go for it, and then other people are saying it'll be too much work. So I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I can see why that would be tough and why that would be a dilemma. When do you have to decide whether you're going to go or not go?
Tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
And yeah, it's for a program. So I'd be doing like a little bit of work, going to some lectures and stuff, but I'd still have like a full blown course to attend.
yeah, when is the when is the trip itself?
It's from July the 17th to the 31st.
Okay, so it's like in the middle of that class. It won't be at the very front end, it won't be at the very back end, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So that would be a consideration.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. But I don't know how intense the course is going to be.
What's the class?
It's what is it? Political risk analysis.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah.
Jasmine, the syllabus is up for that class.
Oh, okay.
I took a look earlier today. At first glance, I'd say like 7 out of 10 intensity, but 2 class meetings with the time difference might be
a bit much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's on Canvas. Okay, thanks.
Well, that'll help a lot.
Yeah, I'll look at that after tonight's class.
That way you can feel like your decision is at least informed by, a greater amount of primary source material to consider. Very good. Well, good luck. Good luck making your choice.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, going to Croatia sounds like an awesome experience, and that would be hard to turn down, certainly. But I understand kind of the other side of the ledger in terms of trying to keep up with other work at the same time. But sounds cool. Sounds really cool. Awesome. Anybody else have anything cool or interesting, fun or exciting, challenging and depressing? Like what's going on?
I just got accepted to one of AU's dual degree programs.
Nice.
So cool.
Nice. Oh, that's awesome. Congrats for that.
Thanks.
What is it?
It's one of the international ones. This one's with Korea University in Seoul. So
sweet. Oh, cool. Oh, that's great. Good to hear. Jeremy, what's up with you?
My best friend's getting married in August, so
making plans.
Yeah, we just came back from Miami last weekend. We spent a couple days in Miami.
Nice. Well, that'll be a good time. Is the wedding in this area or where?
Nah, it's in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay, cool. That'll be fun. It's been a while since I've been to Atlanta, but it's a great city.
Yeah, I love Atlanta.
Awesome. Anybody else? All right, so here's my plan for today. I didn't do a thorough job with you last time just because of time constraints in terms of tips on finding data sets for your final projects. And so I want to start with that. That could be something that takes, a long time and where I demonstrate all sorts of different examples and everything else. But I really want to make this as concise as possible. And so I'm going to focus on a couple of tips and then a couple of very discrete resources. All right. So that's step number one in class, is to discuss, finding data kind of tips and resources. And so we'll talk about that. And then we'll have time right after that, given that, that's related to the final project, to talk about or do a Q&A around your data analysis memo and the research design assignment, and any questions you have about those two assignments, right? They go hand in hand. As you know, the research design assignment is kind of a template that you fill in that shows the basic design, the blueprints, the plans for your data analysis memo. And so that's where you just kind of lay out the core components of your research design. The data analysis memo is your implementation of that plan that then results in, an actual paper. Not as long as let's say most research papers or term papers, but you can think about it as kind of a research note. That's why I call it a data analysis memo, because it's going to focus more on the data analysis and less on doing, a lengthy and extensive review of the literature and a long-winded explication of your theory, right, that supports your hypothesis. You're going to do those things in the smallest of forms. And we can talk more about that later, but the basic gist is the data analysis memo kind of cuts those things short. So that way the bulk of your effort is really the data analysis and obtaining your results and interpreting them and discussing them to demonstrate what you've learned about quantitative analysis and international affairs in this class about a topic that interests you. And so that's, that's going to be kind of subject of a Q&A after we talk about finding data. After that, I want to talk about the Murdy and Pexon reading on women's protest. And we can do a quick kind of reverse engineering of that research design, but I really want to focus our conversation on two things. The first thing is how Murdy and Pexon are essentially taking theory and connecting it to data analysis. They do a rather extensive job at surveying a number of different theories, attaching them to hypotheses and testing all of them. You're doing something very different in your data analysis memo, where you're going to put forward a hypothesis and support it with a little bit of theory, a little bit of theoretical discussion, a couple of paragraphs though, right? Nothing super extensive. And then doing the data analysis. What I think Murdy and Pexon though help us with on that front is just showing, despite the fact that they have multiple theories that they test with multiple hypotheses, what they show is kind of the connection, as we've seen in other studies, the connection between some basic theoretical proposition and then the data analysis to test that proposition, right? And so I want to just make that link. That's number one. And then number two is to kind of think about the storytelling element of their results. How do they tell us the story of their data analysis and the results that they obtained with their presentation of data? And so we're going to take a look in their article and think a little bit about that, because I think that also informs what you're going to be doing with your data analysis memo. So we'll talk about those things. After we discuss the Murdy and Pexon reading, there are two options depending on the amount of time that we have, right? One would then be to do an example of merging data sets, right? Merging multiple data sets together using the Murdy and Pexon data. And so I created an example for you about merging data sets, where essentially, if you don't know what merging is, right, you have, let's say, one variable over here and some other variables over here, but you need them all in the same place so you can conduct your analysis, right? You need them all in the same data set in order to carry out your analysis. So how do you bring them together? You bring them together by merging the files, right? Or by essentially taking some observations or data from one and pulling it into another. So if there's time, we will use the Murdy and Pexin data and pull a new variable into their data set to practice merging. If there's not time for that, I will just post a video that I already made of doing that. It was actually already posted in the meat and potatoes, I think for class 8. It was for a previous class, but I kind of put in the meat and potatoes log, I said, you know, for the future, should you need this, right? And so I'll post it again, but as a handout, so everybody has easy access to it on the class website, if we don't get around to it in class. And actually, I'll post it anyway, just so that way you have it. But you know, sometimes that happens where we don't find a data set that has everything in it that we need, and therefore we need to take from elsewhere and bring them together. And so we might practice merging, or we may just go, depending on time again, to a Q&A around problem set 3, or any other substantive content, you know, that interests you or that's important to you that we've covered in the class, right? So that may be things around multivariate regression analysis. It might be about statistical versus substantive effects and interpreting those differently. It might be about logistic regression, which is kind of recent, the most recent and final method that you learned, right? Logistic regression analysis with dichotomous outcomes. Maybe you have questions about, you know, anything from problem set 2. I am near the finish line of grading problem set 2, and we'll send those back to you tomorrow. So you will have that feedback prior to submitting problem set 3. But if you already know, based on the suggested solutions that I've given you, if you already know you have some questions from problem set 2, I'm happy to discuss those out. So anyway, that'll be an open Q&A around any of those things. So that's my plan for today. And it's during those Q&A periods that if you just want to add other things to the agenda to bring in, then we can certainly address them there. Okay. Before we go, though, right into the tips and resources on finding data for your projects, are there any, you know, kind of administrative or overarching questions or issues you need to voice? Anybody? Good and good? All right. So let's go into finding data. So I'm going to share my screen. And like I said, my goal here is going to be efficiency by not getting into a crazy amount of detail that I think might be overshooting what's necessary. So when it comes to finding data or obtaining data sets specifically for your project, one approach that I want to lead with is essentially doubling down on something that you already know how to do and something you've probably practiced many times before. And that is just finding articles, right? Studies using Academic Search Premier, JSTOR, EBSCO, Scopus, you know, whatever your preferred, you know, databases are for obtaining scholarly publications. Now, you're probably already aware of you know, the library resources and how to navigate those. I hope that that's part of your orientation into graduate school, or it has been, or it's something that you can get elsewhere. But just in case it hasn't been, or you didn't pick up on some of this stuff in your undergrad studies or whatever else, I just want to make you very familiar with a website that you should spend a lot of time on, throughout your graduate coursework. And that is american.edu/library, right? I know these days everybody wants to go to Google, and you think Google Scholar is sufficient to find scholarship because it's Google Scholar. So what could be wrong with that? But really, we want to come here to your library resource. And I would say that the default for a lot of folks is to come here and type in stuff in this kind of mega search bar. I don't like that because it searches out into the abyss. It's kind of just out into some unknown space looking for things that match your keywords. Instead, I think you should search databases and get used to what the different databases are and how you can navigate them. And so there are different databases on different subjects. And so you can narrow by subject if you would like, including international studies, right? So you could specify international studies. You could also specify political science and government, since much of international affairs overlaps with that as well. And then that will narrow down to some of the core databases that we use in international affairs. So, it's up to you, but I would say just as a broad point, start familiarizing yourself with some of these things. We're going to start now, though, with just Academic Search Premier. This one is not specific to international affairs, but it's a really solid database for obtaining scholarly publications. And what I want to say about this is, again, whether you choose this one or JSTOR, or you do opt for Google Scholar or many of the others, Scopus or whatever it might be, one way to find data that will be relevant to the topic that you're interested in is to simply find a study about that topic that uses quantitative data and then to use their data. There's nothing wrong, and in fact, it's an incredibly efficient way, as long as you can obtain that data, to find data sets that speak directly to your topic of interest. And so the way that you might do that, right, if you use one of these databases to search for something generally, right, so maybe you're interested in terrorism, you come and you search for terrorism. And you'll get, 116,470 results on terrorism. And of course, you can limit these results by, for example, clicking on academic journals, because we don't want newspaper articles, we don't want magazine articles, right? We're looking for scholarly publications that are peer-reviewed and empirically based. And so you could click academic journals and it would reduce, right, automatically the studies to those that might potentially have the kind of data, but also are peer-reviewed, which is important. So that applies to searching, for studies on a particular topic, whether it's quantitative or not quantitative. The next step is to utilize Boolean searching. And so some of you probably are familiar with Boolean searching and Boolean search terms like and or not when you search for things. Those are kind of like an if condition in Stata. Those are operators that allow you to either expand your search or contract your search, right? Or is going to expand your search, right? If I type terrorism or political violence, then I'm going to get studies in my results that match terrorism or political violence. And therefore, my results are going to grow, right? It becomes a more expansive search, right? And even again, if I do academic journals, right, it's a more expansive search than it was before. Now, if I use the operator and, right, then it's going to require both things. Now, I'm not going to write political violence here because I want to tell you the thing that helps with finding data sets. You could write quantitative. And so now I want terrorism studies, but I also want quantitative studies, or studies that return some results that have quantitative somewhere in the study. And so I can search that. And using that and operator is going to limit my search. Notice now I have 467 results. Okay, much more doable compared to 116,000. Again, I could limit further to academic journals and it would go down to 390, right? So it would reduce even further. Now, one other thing that we can do is, well, and so let me say two things on this front. First of all, you have to use generally in most of these searches, you have to use capitalized letters for Boolean searching. So and, or, and not, you capitalize those, right? That's different than this, right? So it's and means require both. EBSCOhost, which hosts Academic Search Premier, as well as most others, allow a kind of advanced search, which is what we're looking at, even though this is their basic search. Most other places allow an advanced search that has multiple bars like we have here, multiple search bars. And this allows you automatically to use and or not as Boolean searching. So I could replicate exactly what I did a second ago, right? Because I have terrorism and quantitative. You with me there? What's nice about that is that, first of all, it doesn't get kind of messy with one long search term, especially if you don't know all of the nuances of Boolean searching. Another, though, is that you can separately pick what field you expect to find these terms in. So, for example, I might want to find terrorism in the subject terms, right? Subjects, right? So terrorism. But I might not necessarily require that quantitative is a subject term. Maybe I want quantitative to be in the title, right? Because I figure if I find an article on terrorism where quantitative is in the title, then it's either a review of quantitative studies about terrorism, or it is a study that is statistical or quantitative about terrorism. So I could require that quantitative shows up in the title. And that's going to be a very limited search, right? We only get 17 results there. But what it means is we're pretty damn sure that it's going to be a quantitative study, and we may be able to then obtain the data from that quantitative study. Okay. You could also require that it's in the abstract. And so generally speaking, even if quantitative isn't in the title, if it's a quantitative study, it will then be represented as such in the abstract itself, right? This is a quantitative study, blah, blah, blah. Now, we can go ahead and search that, terrorism and quantitative in the abstract, right? And now we get more results than before, which makes sense because we've made it more open than just the title. Now it's the abstract. We could also do or statistical. So maybe we want terrorism and quantitative or statistical in the abstract, right? It doesn't matter which. That's more expansive. We've now grown our search to include terrorism and quantitative or terrorism and statistical. And so we'll probably get a few more results here. Yeah, about twice the number of results there, okay? So these are ways to look for quantitative studies or statistical studies about your particular subject or topic. And of course, you could add some other things to this, right? So if you want terrorism and quantitative and statistical, and maybe you're interested in ideology, right? Or ideological inclinations of terrorist groups or something like that, you could add that as a requirement. Let me give you just one other piece. I didn't see how this could easily become like an hour and a half. I didn't intend to tell you about this, but I might as well mention it. There's also something called a wildcard that you can use where, let's say we want to have the possibility of results that include terrorism, terrorist, ideology, right? Ideologue, right? Any of those different things, we could just add an asterisk in those two places. And now this will capture terrorists and anything that comes after it. Terrorist, terrorism, terrorists, right? So it includes all. Same with ideologue, asterisk. Ideologue, ideology, ideological, right? Any of those things that start with ideologue, right? And so we can require, let's say that that's in the abstract as well. And now we have 23 results, right? And so I would essentially do a couple of things, and we're going to move on past this. But if I found a quantitative study in here, for example, in the studies in conflict and terrorism, that's the journal. And here is, here is a study. You can, of course, read the abstract. Quantitative methodology to identify pure types was used with START's global terrorism database, blah, 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 right? You might be able to obtain the data from this particular study. How would you do that? Well, I'm going to show you one way, and that is to look in one of our data repositories, right? Essentially, it's a JSTOR for data sets for this particular study, right? Another is to search the author. See if they have their own website, academic or professional website, and see if they host their data there. That's where I got the Murdy and Pexon data on women's protest. That's where I got the Dunning and Harrison data. I got it from Thad Dunning's website. And in fact, so I did, so I'm going to look here. So this is Sabine Carey. If anybody has watched from the class website here, I posted for you handout 15, a mini tutorial of about 20 minutes I mentioned in my email this past weekend about narrowing and defining and specifying your research question and topic, right? How do you go from something big, like a big topic area, and narrow and define it into something more specific and therefore feasible for a research study? One of the examples that I gave in there was Civil War. I said, well, you might be interested in Civil War, but how do we narrow that down into a specific like subtopic that's concrete and feasible? And I said, well, maybe you're interested in the relationship between governments and militias, right? Particularly militias that fight on behalf of the government in civil wars, right? So what about that relationship between them? Okay, well, what's interesting about that? Well, maybe we're interested in the support that governments give to their allied militias and how that varies across wars, for example. So we're narrowing and defining and specifying. And as I was going through that example, I thought, well, where could I find, some data on that front? So I did exactly this process where I searched in here, right, for Civil War and militias and government ally or something like that. Maybe it was pro-government and militia and Civil War. I think that was more or less it, right? It was like pro-government and militia and Civil War and quantitative or something like that, right? And ultimately in that search, I came across, and I already actually knew of this, this scholar, but I came across an article by Sabine Carey about pro-government militias. And I thought, well, awesome. I will go and see if she has the data on her website. And it turns out that she does have that data, right? Data on pro-government militias in intrastate conflict. And so again, one of the ways for you to obtain that data, if you find a quantitative article, right, like archetypal terrorist events in the United States, is to go and search the author, just Google the author and see if they have a website where they host data. Sometimes they'll host the data for this particular study. Sometimes though, which is really fun and exciting, is when you find that they host data on the topic that you're interested in, right? They've created a data set, but maybe it's not the one from this study, but it's another one that's really interesting for you, okay? So you can go and search that way. The other way is to read within the study itself to see where their data comes from or where it's hosted. I would say maybe 4 times out of 5, right? 8 times out of 10. The author will state very clearly and explicitly where you can get this data, oftentimes with a link that you can click on to get it. Other times they'll say that this data comes from some data project like this one, START's Global Terrorism Database. And so now you've come to the realization that there's this database called the Global Terrorism Database. You can go search that and see how you can download their data. START is actually hosted at the University of Maryland, right? Very close to AU, and it's a long-standing global terrorism project. And it goes outside of the United States, right? And so you can find data on terrorism all around the world. So the point is, that's a second way to go about it, right? Is to just read through the article or look in the specific research design section of the article to find where they mention the source of their data comes from, and then to go get it directly from there. And of course, you could also just Control F or Command F and type the word data, right? And it'll search the article for you for the word data. Another way, right, is to search within a particular database, like I said, a kind of JSTOR for data sets. And 2 of those that I've mentioned to you before and that are part of the handout that I gave you earlier in the term, handout 5 on quantitative data sources, I want to quickly talk to you about here. One of them is the Harvard Dataverse. And so you can just do dataverse.harvard.edu, or you can Google the Harvard Dataverse. Again, this is on the handout that I gave you before. And you could just search, you know, automatically here, all of the data sets that are hosted. In short, the Harvard Dataverse is a place where people who conduct a study or create a data project to collect data will host their data, right? So it's just like an online forum or repository where authors and researchers and scholars and analysts will post data sets so other people can use them. And so you could come in here and you could search the Dataverse, you know, on, you know, corruption. And you might find, you know, some data on corruption. Here's a cross-national survey data on corruption. What I think is particularly interesting and helpful for you all is when you find replication data. Replication data is specifically data that was used for a research study, for a specific article, that then gets posted here. So here is replication data for the article, Governance in Managing Public Health Resources in Brazilian Municipalities, right? Here's replication data for rooting out corruption or rooting for corruption, the heterogeneous electoral consequences of scandals. So that's an interesting one. Here is the Corruption Perceptions Index by Transparency International. So a couple things about the Dataverse, right? One is you want to reduce the size of results that you get by clicking Harvard Dataverse. We don't want all of these harvested data sets. Harvested data sets means that the Dataverse has kind of scoured the internet really quickly for data sets on this topic and pulled them in, but usually they're not the kind of data sets we want to use, right? It'll be like ABC News poll or what, but not good, you know, kind of cross unit you know, data that we can actually analyze. So anyway, the first thing is to just choose that we only want Harvard Dataverse data sets that are hosted on the Dataverse itself. A second thing that you can do, depending on your topic, is to click social sciences. And so that way we get rid of studies in law or studies in business management or studies in, health or life sciences or medicine. And we focus just on the social science studies, which of course is what we're focusing on. Okay. Another thing that we can do, right, within the Dataverse, and this is again linking back to finding a study originally by a particular author, right? I don't know if this author will be in here, but we can look up Russell Lundberg, right? Russell Lundberg, and see if he hosts any data. I just wanted to make sure I spelled it right, on the Dataverse. And it doesn't look like it. It looks like there's some Ian Lundberg, but there's not a Russell Lundberg. What about Sabine Carey? Now we have Sabine Carey, replication data for spoilers of peace, pro-government militias as risk factors for conflict recurrence. So even if we didn't find a website for Sabine Carey, after finding her article about pro-government militias and seeing that it was quantitative in nature, we could come here to the Dataverse and search her name, right? And she has her own Dataverse where she posts data, and we get data on pro-government militias, as well as the specific replication data for that study, Spoilers for Peace. You with me there? We can also do terrorism like we did before, just to stick with the same topic for a minute, right? Terrorism. You'll see I did this yesterday as well. And now we get a bunch of results on terrorism, including that START terrorism database, the global terrorism database. We could click social sciences to reduce our results. We can also, as I said before, click the Harvard Dataverse because we don't want the harvested ones. So click the Harvard Dataverse so we only get those. And then, as you saw from a minute ago, right, we get 394 results, and we can scroll through here and look at the different kinds of data that are presented under the search term terrorism. All of these would be quantitative data sets in some way, shape, or form, right? Police responses to terrorism in Israel, government actions in a terror environment, that's also in Israel. Replication data for an article called Predicting Non-State Terrorism Worldwide. An experimental study of the effects of government terror warnings on people's political attitudes. So that would be survey data about people's attitudes following terror warnings that are coming from the government, right? So, there's a whole bunch of really great data here. Big, Allied, and Dangerous. This is the bad database. This is also about terrorism, but specifically about organizations, not about terrorism incidents, right? So it has a different unit of analysis. And so all of these are about terrorism. And what we can do, just like before, is add an operator like and or not, and narrow or expand our scope. So maybe we're interested not just in terrorism, but terrorism recruitment, right? Or the recruitment of terrorists. We could, if we want, again, to use a wild card, it would be terrorist asterisk, and then we can limit just to things about recruitment. And maybe we want recruitment or recruiting or recruits. So we could do an asterisk there as well and search. And the Dataverse will kick us back some results. And now, right, because we focus just on terrorism and recruitment, we get 30 results, not 394, right? Profiles of perpetrators of terrorism in the United States, assigning blame, well, the impact of US drone strikes on terrorism in Pakistan, right? So all of these will have data that you could use. Assessing the effect of gender norms on the lethality of female suicide terrorism. Interesting study. So this is how you can go about using the Harvard Dataverse. What you would do, just sorry, I should have made this clear from the start, is let's choose this one here from the International Studies Quarterly, evidence from the Islamic State about who wants to be a suicide bomber. I don't know this article. Well, let's do this one. Wolves in sheep's clothing, assessing the effect of gender norms on the lethality of female suicide terrorism. We can look here and see the data, okay? I just want to show you what a result looks like because I've shown you a bunch of results, but what about when we actually click on one to get the data? It's very common for you to see the data posted in one of a few file types. One might be .csv, comma, separated values. Another one might be .tab, which is tabular data. Another one might be XLS because it would open in Microsoft Excel. There are a variety of these different types of data. The Dataverse generally posts these files as .tabs, which are, again, tabular. You can think about it as like a text file separated by tabs. But you can download it in Stata format, generally speaking. So if you come here and you want to access the file, the .tab file is a file that can be opened in Excel and also then in Stata. And so if you want that data, you would just do this to access file, and you would click Stata binary. Okay, Stata binary. Then you can open it immediately in Stata. So look, I just downloaded that data. I'm going to click it and open it. Okay, check for updates. And now I have the data in Stata. Right, here's the data set. Beautiful. Okay. This data set happens to have very well labeled variables. Sometimes you'll be disappointed to find out that the authors didn't do a very good job at labeling the variables in their data set. Sometimes you can still piece it together because they maybe have a code book, right? Let's see if this one has a code book. This one has an appendix. That probably isn't it, but you could look at that. It has do files. So this one does not have a code book, probably because they did a really good job at coding their data and labeling their data in the data set itself. Sometimes there will be a code book with it that tells you exactly what the variables are, that it correspond to certain variable names. Sometimes, unfortunately, you find a data set and it's not well labeled and there's no code book and you frankly just can't use it. You know, you try to maybe look at the article to figure out which variables in the article correspond to what in the data set, and it's just too hard to figure out. And so you just go and find something else then, okay? But anyway, here's a good example. So I just downloaded that, again, Stata binary. If this is not an option, then download it as tab delimited. And I will show you how to, okay, tab delimited. And I will show you how to import that into Stata, a .tab file. You import it the same way you import a .csv file, or the same way you import a .xls file. And I have a little tutorial that shows you how to do that, but really quickly, you just do file import in Stata. Okay, file import. If you have an Excel sheet, right, it's XLS, then you click this. If it's some sort of text data like CSV or tab, like the one we just downloaded, then you would do this one, right? Delimited CSV text data. Right, so you click that. It's going to open up this little wizard for you, and you simply go and find the .tab file that you just downloaded, right? So this is .tab, and there's the data, right? I just simply clicked on the file I just downloaded in my downloads folder, and now here's the data. Okay, I can hit OK. And now I have the data here. All right, so that's how you import, but I have a little, tutorial I can help you later if you have this specific issue about importing data from a CSV or a tab file or an Excel file into Stata directly. Okay, so that's using the Dataverse. Another one that I'll just show you quickly, I mean, I've already talked to you a lot about searching, but another one is ICPSR. Okay, and so this is also linked on the handout 5. This is also linked in handout 5 about data sets. I'm trying to find the chat so I can also just put this link in there. There it is, ICPSR. And so this is the example I did last night. I might as well do it again. Let's say we're interested in women's political representation, right? We can search that term and we find different results, right? Here's a specific one on women's representation and crime in India. So if you're interested in doing a study specific to India, might want to look at that. If you're not, then skip it. Here's one on health and the political agency of women. So that might be interesting, right? In terms of political representation as a form of agency, right? Political agency, and how that might be associated with health. Here's a cross-national study of women in parliament, right? And so this would be, is there, a quota system in a particular country for women in legislatures? Or you read Michael Rossford today about oil, Islam, and women. Yes. And of course, his main dependent variable is about gender equality and gender inequality. But he measures that in a few different ways, right? One of the ways he measures it is as the percentage of women in parliament or the percentage of women in a national legislature across countries. I mean, I don't know if he got his data from this data set, but he got it from something like it, right? Where it's a data set that gives you the percentage of the national legislature that is composed of women or by women. So you can click on that result and then ultimately come to download it here. You can download it in different formats. Notice the Stata format to make things easy for you, right? If you click Stata, it may download or it may ask you to register. Okay, so right now it's just asking for me to agree. Yes, so I just wanted to make this point. If you're going to use ICPSR, you do need to register or sign in. You can sign in with Google or LinkedIn, or you can register. No matter what, it's free. And this is a super reputable place out of the University of Michigan, so they're not going to spam you. It's not like a place that you shouldn't register. Like, it's perfectly fine to register to obtain data through ICPSR. Okay, so this is how you would get data from there. Download it, and you can use it. Sometimes they have, again, documentation. So this one only has, well, it looks like it has a folder that may have within it the data, but also maybe a code book and things like that. So you'll just have to see once you download the file, okay? Oh yeah, there's a code book, and you can even preview the code book. Here it is, and it tells you, what is included in the data set, okay? So women in parliament, it has case ID, region, country, right? And then eventually percentage of women in the parliamentary body, across years. So you'd really have to, download the PDF and search it, but it is what we thought it was, basically. One other nice thing that you can do just very quickly is to look at the publications related to this data. So if you click data related publications, it'll give you the publications that they're aware of that have specifically used this data. And so you could go essentially and try to obtain the replication data for those studies. Because it's possible that this study on breaking the judicial glass ceiling uses this women in parliament data, but maybe also has some other variables in it that come from other places that you might be interested in using. You with me there? This study obviously uses the women in parliament data set, but it might also contain data from other sources that they've merged together to do their article on judicial, women's representation. So, consider that as well. It also gives you a sense of what authors you might search for if you want to go the author route, right? So there's a lot of different ways to skin this cat. I'm trying to give you a sense of what they are as efficiently as possible. Two last things. So another one, and I know I kind of forswore Google a minute ago, but there is relatively recently this data set search. And I don't actually prefer using this. I just put it in the chat, but it can be helpful if you're wanting to do kind of a broader search, in the dark, where it will look in the Dataverse for you. It will look in ICPSR for you, and it will also look in other open data sources for you. So if you search something like, human trafficking, say you're interested in that, then it gives you some results. Number of human trafficking victims worldwide over this decade. The UK human trafficking data set. Data, this is an ICPSR study, right? Data from prostitution, human trafficking, and victim identification. Here's one, law enforcement response to human trafficking and the implications of victims in the US. I was hoping for something that was cross-national. Here's one on human trafficking policy and its effect on trafficking attitudes. Here we go, global human trafficking. That's something I was looking for. So it's like human trafficking. Let's also include, let's see if there's something if we do cross-national. Human trafficking indicators, a new data set. So this may be something. Yeah. So this is about anti-trafficking efforts in 179 countries from 2000 to 2011. So this is anti-trafficking, right? And what kind of policies or laws different governments use, or maybe the extent to which they try to combat human trafficking through their anti-trafficking efforts. So this is a way you can do that. Explore at the Harvard Dataverse will link you over to the Dataverse where we just were. So the Google search is another way to just kind of search all of these simultaneously. Shannon, go ahead. Do you have a question?
I kind of do. It's a bit of a half-baked question because I keep thinking myself in circles about it. But I remember when we were talking about coming up with research questions, you said something like you don't want to have a question that you already know the answer to. And so or something where like you already have an answer in mind. And so I'm just confusing myself thinking about how you're supposed to find data sets for something that you're not supposed to have answers to. Like if you wanted to talk about like female political action and as it relates to health, if you're doing something like what explains female political action and you want to talk about health, that's not really in line with like not going into your research question knowing the answer.
Yeah. So let's take a quick second to talk about that, and it'll also give us a chance to just breathe on the data, finding data for a moment, and then we'll pick up there where we just left off. I'll finish it in 4 to 5 minutes because we're kind of at the end, but I do want to answer your question now. That comment is about how you want to ask the question in the first place. It's not that I want you to not have ideas about how to answer it. It's really about the phrasing, right? The actual like syntax of the sentence that you ask, why or what explains variation in something. We don't want to commit to some answer in that first question. For example, in problem set 2, some folks wrote something like, what explains the relationship between refugees from neighboring countries and Civil War onset? And we're not in the business of explaining relationships. We're in the business of explaining variation in outcomes. And then putting forward a hypothesis about a relationship that answers that question. You with me there? And so instead of asking what explains this relationship between cause and effect, we don't actually know that there is a relationship between that potential cause and effect, right? That's the point of a hypothesis, is that we go in not knowing. And so that comment saying that I don't want you to commit to to an answer in the question itself is just about how you write the question. But you, of course, will have in mind some sort of, causal explanation that you want to put forward as a hypothesis. And so what I've written on some of the problem set twos, when when somebody has written that question, or, what is the role of refugees in explaining Civil War onset? I said, well, that's good, but that's your follow-up question to the first one. The first question is, what explains variation in outcome? Or why do we observe this outcome in some places, but this other outcome in other places, right? Or at certain times, but not other times. And so here it's just, what explains Civil War onset, right? Or why do some countries experience the onset of civil conflict at some times, but not others? We focus purely on the dependent variable. And just as a quick, attack onto that, the reason we do that, and the reason I'm adamant about asking questions in that way, is because we want to then allow ourselves to explore the literature, see what other answers are out there, what other answers exist in the scholarship, and then to figure out what hypothesis we want to assert or put forward and how it fits within that other array of answers. And so if we ask the question, what explains the relationship between refugees and civil conflict, then we've essentially put blinders on ourselves from the very beginning and not allowed ourselves, based on our question, to explore other factors that affect Civil War onset, except for refugees, right? And so that's the point there. It's a really great question, though, and I appreciate it. Did I answer your conundrum? Fantastic. So to wrap up on the data front, there are just two other quick things I want to say, I believe. One is, you might also find a study or multiple studies that are coming from specific journals, right? And as you go through graduate school, just to put this in a broader perspective, you want to become a little bit familiar with the journals that publish articles on the things you're most interested in, right? And so sometimes it's a regional article, journal, right? It's a journal focused on a particular region, right? Journal for Mediterranean Studies, Journal of African Politics, Journal of, East Asian Affairs, different journals on different regions. Sometimes, right, and more often, it's journals that kind of focus on broad topic areas, right? So the Journal of International Development is going to be about development studies. It's going to be less likely that you find in that journal a study about international warfare or, environmental, climate change and the politics of that per se. I mean, you might find a couple articles in there, but generally it's focused on, development. If you're interested in conflict, right, you might look at the journal Conflict Management and Peace Science, CMPS, or you might look at the Journal of Peace Research, JPR, right? If you're interested in interactions between states, right? Like international war, international relations in its kind of most traditional sense, then you might look at International Interactions, II. If you're a foreign policy person, Foreign Policy Analysis is your journal, right? And we don't want to be myopic and only have one journal, but we want to have a sense of the topics that we're most interested in, right, that you're taking classes on, that you're part of a particular program, right? What are the main journals that produce the good scholarship coming out of that area? Once you know that, you can go to those journals, right? So I just said conflict management and peace science. And you can go to the journal's site, right? It's hosted by SAGE. It's a SAGE journal, right? And you can look in here at the latest articles, right? Extended intergroup contact and frozen conflicts. Evidence from Cyprus. You can look at, or any of these others, right? Environmental shocks, civil conflict, and aid effectiveness. Somebody's working on, climate change in the environment and civil conflict. So this might be an article to look at. You can look at the most read articles, the most cited articles, from this particular journal. Why I wanted to bring this into our data conversation is that you can search within this journal. And you can search within pretty much any journal if you go to that journal's site. So this is, again, the site for conflict management and peace science. They're going to have a search bar somewhere where you can search specifically that journal, or you could search all journals hosted by SAGE. You don't want that, right? You want this journal. And then you can search your terms if you want. What I like to do, especially when I look for data sets to use in this class, is to simply search the term data set. Now we get articles that are introducing data sets. The power sharing event data set, a new data set on the promises and practices of power sharing. UN fatality. So this is the Hanke data set that we read on day 1 or 2 of the class, right? UN fatalities. Partisan electoral interventions by great powers, introducing the PEIG data set, right? On partisan electoral interventions by great powers, right? Intervention in foreign elections. If you're interested in political crises, right? Crises and near crises in world politics. So this is another way. Go to a journal's website and simply search for the word data set. Okay. And the very last thing is 2 in 1. So this is a twofer, but it's the last. So I've given you now a lot of opportunities to find data. And so I think there's the potential here for you to find really interesting indicators, measures to represent the things that you want to study. You can find some really interesting data sets. We've seen some really interesting ones in the last 45 minutes. And so you can find some really interesting data. At the same time, as a last resort, I would prefer you kind of put this in that part of the priority list. There are a couple of places where you can find broad cross-national or time series cross-national data. One of them is the quality of governance data set at the University of Gothenburg. This is a data set from which I drew some years ago the state year data set that we use in class. I only took certain variables from it. This state year data, this quality of government data set is a country year data set that has hundreds of variables in it at the level of countries or countries by year. Hundreds of variables on different topics. You can search those variables with their variable search tool here. So if you click this, right, you can wait for this to load and then just use, Control F or Command F or just search up here. It'll eventually load though. And you can search for, different things. We did corruption before. You can search corruption and it'll process, and then eventually kick us some results specific to corruption. Another way to do it that I would tend to look at it is just to hit Control F and type in the word corruption. Oh, it already did filter them for us. And here are all variables on corruption in some way, shape, or form, right? Corruption perceptions, anti-corruption commissions and whether they're present in the constitution of a country or not, some measure of anti-corruption policy, etc. Are there independent bodies to investigate cases of public corruption? That kind of thing, right? So you can search that here. You can also, I think you see the categories, right? So you can limit by categories. Another way to do this is to just go to their data downloads page, and you'll see that they have a number of different data sets, right? The data sets that I want you to consider are these two here. And again, you're considering these because you did put some effort into finding a data set elsewhere. And you just didn't find a good replication study, or you didn't find a good data set, right? And so you come here instead. The basic data set and the standard data set both have hundreds of variables in them. The standard data set, though, happens to be enormous, right? With like 2,000, as it says here, 2,000 variables. The basic data set has like, I think, a few hundred. Generally, the basic data set will serve your purposes. You can find indicators in there on a lot of different topics that will suit your needs. The standard data set is actually probably too big for you to open anyway. But if you come to find that the variable or whatever that you really want to use or really need to use for your project is in the standard data set, I can help you get it out. But again, I would much prefer you find something in the data set you can open, which is the basic data set. When you go here, you can look at the code book. Notice that there are two versions. There's a cross-sectional version, which is just countries. And then there's a time series version, which is countries over time. So in this cross-sectional data, the maximum number of observations you can have is like 196 or maybe 205, depending on how they count countries. The time series data will be like the state year data set that we use, time series cross-sectional data, okay? You can download it in Stata format, but what I would recommend, right, is that you look at the code book. You can just download that PDF, it opens here, right? And you can see that it describes the data set, right? It spends some pages describing the data project. Essentially what they've done is taken data from all sorts of other projects and brought it together into one big data set. Kind of like the state year data set does in our class. But again, I only kept, maybe like 50 or 60 variables for the state year data set. This has data and variables on all of these different categories: welfare, religion, economy, political systems, parties and elections, media, migration, history, health, gender equality, environment, right? All of these different things. You can then come down and look at the specific variables in those categories, right? General quality of government, there's anti-corruption policy, monopoly of the use of force, fragile states index, which we've seen in studies before, earlier in the semester. That was in the Moore and Shellman reading. Bribery rates, government effectiveness as an index. There are things in civil society like political participation, right? Socioeconomic barriers. Okay, so right, there's stuff in conflict and military service, stuff in education. What I want to show you very quickly is, let's say, let's say we're interested in, Women's Political Empowerment Index from VDEM. So we can click on the page number and it will take us right to that. Women's Political Empowerment Index from VDEM, right? It'll tell you now, this is the beauty of this code book. It'll tell you, right, how politically empowered are women is the question this variable is trying to answer. And then it gives you some discussion of the coding. If you scroll up a little bit to the beginning of this section, notice this is 4.70.4.3.2.1. we get to the VDEM data set that it comes from, and it gives you the link to that data project, right? To the original source. So if you're going to use this, you should go to the original source just to learn a little bit more about the data that you're using. But at the end of the day, right, we get the Women Political Empowerment Index from VDEM, and it tells you a little bit about this data. A couple things here, right? It shows you, first of all, the geospatial coverage of this variable, right? It's essentially covering the entire world, 173 countries. And it also tells you that it has a time series component to it where it is time series cross-sectional. There are other variables in this data set where you will find have a smaller temporal scope, right? Notice this one doesn't cover all of those years. It starts in 1990 on human development. And then there are others, right? This has a very small temporal scope on corruption perceptions. But there are others that do not have a time series component. So you would only find the variable on policy performance, social policies, safe living conditions. You would only find that in the cross-national data set. You would not find it in the time series data set. Okay, so use this code book to figure out what variables you might want to use if, again, you end up using this data set. The very last one is the World Bank open data set. And this is just a website, data.worldbank.org. And in here, you can search all sorts of things. So I know somebody was interested in like research and development. And so there's a research and development expenditures as percentage of GDP indicator. So you can click on that. You can download that as a variable. But you're not going to do that, and I'll tell you why in just a second. You can also just look at individual indicators by category. So agriculture and rural development, here's a bunch of indicators, like forest area as a percentage of land area. We've used that in class. It came from here, World Bank. Okay? On all sorts of things, aid effectiveness, climate change, economy and growth, et cetera, okay? So the World Bank also provides time series cross-national data, last resort, just like the quality of government data set is. But if you end up using it, you end up using it, and that's fine by me. The caveat I want to provide to World Bank Open Data is that there is a package in Stata, right, that we can install called WB Open Data that allows you to pull any indicator that you find on this website directly into Stata as a Stata data set. So you don't have to download individual indicators, merge them together, bring them into Stata separately through the import command, right? Instead, there's a package that you just install data from the World Bank directly. I have a tutorial that I've recorded for you, and I'm going to post it as handout 16 right after class for how to do that if you do end up wanting to use World Bank data. Okay? And so I will post that for you. That's the end with one final just note, not resource. The final note on all of this, because I know that's overwhelming in terms of the amount of information and resources now that you can obtain. My final piece of advice is don't be too picky, right? Remember the goal. The goal here is to demonstrate your learning, right, in a kind of introduction to quantitative analysis in international affairs on a topic that generally interests you. So don't be too picky. You may find a data set that is on the topic that you are interested in, but it doesn't have the exact variables you would need to test your specific hypothesis that you've created in your head or that you've put in your problem set, right? Fine, change your hypothesis. Change it to something that's in the data set, right? This is not your thesis. This is not, your first manuscript for publication. This is not, more than it is. This is your opportunity to have a general topic area and then to narrow it down into something that you could feasibly study with the data that you've been able to obtain. So don't be such a purist, that like you spend an excess number of hours looking for the perfect data set to test your hypothesis only to find out that it doesn't exist, right? Have a topic, have a general kind of thrust, find a data set, and then match your hypothesis and your study and your test to the data that you've been able to find relatively efficiently. And so that's my, kind of parting suggestion to you. With that, before we take a few minutes break, what questions do you have about the research design assignment or the data analysis memo, the final project?
Is there an estimate of like how long or how big the data sets need to be? Because there's just such a broad scope there.
Yes, there is, right? So what you need is a large N data set. And that's because we can't do valid statistical analysis on 7 observations, right? Or 25 observations. And so we do need a large N, right? Large number of observations data set. I would say the minimum would be to do, if you were to do like a cross-national study, for example, would be to have, almost full coverage of the world, meaning 150, 160, 170, 80 countries. That's the smallest number of observations I think you should try to use in a study and still be able to obtain any kind of valid results. You might recall that Michael Ross's article uses a time series cross-sectional data set with thousands of observations, but then he also does, in some of his analysis, examine just a cross-national data set, looking at, I think, 165 or 162 countries. Fine, you can do that. But you cannot, like I had a really unfortunate situation with a student a few years ago who comes in, and this is when I was requiring presentations in class on the last day, and he had a really thoughtful study, honestly, really thoughtful. But when the rubber met the road in terms of the data that he could obtain, and he didn't realize this, but it was a question that I kind of just asked in the presentation, his number of observations was 11, right? So he had essentially 11 observations. And of course, I didn't raise it in a jerk fashion. I just said, look, one of the limitations that you're facing here and why you obviously don't have significant results in any way, even though your hypothesis is very valid, is because the number of observations you have is not conducive to this type of analysis. So I think I'm glad you raised that question because that is an important point. You need to have a large N. Generally, right, you're going to find data sets that have thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands maybe. Well, that's big data, and I doubt you'll find data sets like that. But you're going to find survey data sets with thousands of respondents, or conflict data sets with thousands or hundreds of observations, or whatever it may be. So, or dyadic relations between country A and country B, or country F and country J, right? And you're going to have a dyadic data set with, then you might get tens of thousands of observations. But definitely you want to be north of 100, and if it's a cross-national study, you need to make sure that you have almost complete data coverage for each of your variables for every country, right? Because you know that data will automatically kind of drop out of a regression analysis or something like that. Any observations that don't have data, right, that has a missing value for any of the variables. And so you might have 165 countries in your data set, but if there's missing data for some of those different variables and you plug them into a regression, you might all of a sudden have only 72 observations for that particular command, for that particular estimation. So I hope I answered your question, but.
Yeah, I was also going to ask there's a similar thing with the missing data. So can we take a really vast data set and then like narrow the observations down to ones that have all of the data that we're interested in, that are not missing?
Yes.
Okay, so we don't need to include all of the observations of a massive data set. We can
That's correct. For example, you might say, I mean, let that be determined by the scope of your study. You might say, what, maybe your study is, your hypothesis is about, um, trust in government. I'm trying to think of what might make sense. Something like trust in government, the relationship between terrorism and trust in government during the war on terror, okay? Or after 9/11. You might find a data set that has terrorism and trust in government in it that goes back to 1992. But the scope of your study, right, as defined, is after 9/11. And so then just drop out the observations that are before 2001. So, that kind of thing you can do. Just be careful about dropping data. I think it makes better sense generally to use if conditions to exclude data as opposed to just dropping it out of the data set wholesale. Somebody asked a question about that. I think Melissa Cho from the other section, I believe she asked a question about that in the forum that you might want to review in terms of making sure you don't drop valid observations just because they're missing on one variable doesn't mean they don't have relevant data on other variables. So, just because it's missing on the variable that you're using for this question doesn't mean you should just drop that entire case or observation out of the data set, because it might be relevant for other analyses on other variables.
Thanks.
Yeah. Good. Other questions? So we'll take a break in just a second. But to wrap on this issue of research design assignments and the data analysis memo, I just want to remind you, it was in the last email, of course, but I just want to remind you that you have a few things, plus a new thing that I just kind of made live. You have for the research design assignment, the template that you are to complete. And you literally just fill this in like we do for any of the empirical studies in class, right? When we reverse engineer Murdy and Pexon in a few minutes, what's the research question? We generally skip over the basic motivation, but I want you to essentially motivate your question. Why is this interesting, right? Maybe you reference a couple of cases that represent the variation, that you're raising in your question. Maybe there's a debate in the literature, and so you reference one study that's on this side of the debate and one study that's on that side of the debate. Basically motivate your question with a little bit of an introduction. This is quick and dirty here in the research design assignment. You then present a mini theoretical argument. In short, what is the basic logic of your causal relationship that you're going to assert in your hypothesis, right? Ground it theoretically, right? And so here you're generally going to want to cite a couple of sources. Again, just a couple or few. We're not doing a full lit review here. After that, it's the unit of analysis and the scope of your study, right? We'll see that in Murdy and Pexon. We've seen it many times before, right? If it's country year, what's the scope of countries? What are the years? If it's survey respondents, like in the cousinage in Mali study, it was, it was like particular survey respondents. I can't remember where they were coming from exactly, but there was some mention of like who was, represented as participants in the study. If it's conflicts, if it's protests, if it's treaties, right? What is the unit of analysis and what is its scope? Assert a hypothesis and justify it, which kind of refers back to the theoretical argument, and then talk about your variables, right? What's your dependent variable? Where does it come from? How is it measured? What are its particular values? How is it coded, right? So you're just describing your variables just like, we've seen in other studies. You may have a second hypothesis that falls within the same general theory, but you're just wanting to throw out another hypothesis. For example, remember the Bierson-Tyrone reading about foreign aid and economic growth, and foreign aid and economic reform. Both of those were about the effect of foreign aid on reform and growth, on two very kind of economic outcomes. One about liberalization, economic liberalization, and the other one about growth as a result of that. So those are two separate hypotheses, right? The Ross reading you did for today is about how oil wealth affects women's labor force participation and how oil wealth affects women's political influence. So both of them are about oil wealth and gender equality, but there were kind of two sub-hypotheses, that flesh that out. So you're welcome to have two hypotheses if you think it will make your study more robust. What control variables will you include in your multivariate model? And then just what are the appropriate methods? Just like you practice in problem set 2. The independent variable is dichotomous, the dependent variable is continuous, and therefore I do a difference of means test for my bivariate analysis, right? For the multivariate analysis, oh, and you don't need to do that. I need to take this out. You do not need to do a preliminary bivariate test. So I'm going to revise this. I'll include it in the announcement. You don't need to do this in the research design assignment. I mean, you're doing enough here. You don't need to also do some preliminary stata work. So I'll take out doing the preliminary test. Then after that, what's the method for multivariate analysis? My dependent variable is dichotomous, and therefore I'm doing logistic regression. And then you write your equation. Okay? I'll talk later to you about the wrinkle or complication or richness thing. So I'm going to skip that for now. So number one, you have the research design assignment template, and you simply are going to type in your research design after I update the template, which I'll do tomorrow. The data analysis project has instructions that I want you to review because these are the guidelines for the project. Okay, so this is what it entails. This is what you need to do. This gives you the full sense of your objective. You also then, and this is the new thing, have an outline. This is a suggestion. You don't have to follow it perfectly. If you want to use slightly different sections or subheadings or whatever else, that's fine. But I've provided you with an outline that generally the studies we've looked at in class follow. And generally most empirical studies in the social sciences follow this basic structure. And honestly, if you're more than welcome to print this and keep this for the future, because if you keep this in mind, you can much more efficiently churn through a lot of the kind of academic articles. I mean, not so much the books per se, if you're reading books in your classes, but if you're reading like scholarship in journal articles, they're all, as long as they're empirical, right, based on observation and analysis, even the qualitative ones, the case studies, everything else, they'll follow this general structure. And it makes it really efficient for you to find what you need and then get out. So you're not spending, 45 minutes reading an article. So I think this is a valid outline that you could essentially follow for your data analysis memo. And with that said, are there any final questions about that? Okay, see you back here at 5 after 7. Okay. So we're now going to talk about Murdy and Pexon. We'll try to do a pretty efficient job with that. So that way, if you have questions about problem set 3, or you want to rehash anything about, recent topics like multivariate regression or logistic regression analysis, marginal effects, predicted probabilities, anything like that, I'm more than happy to review those. But first, I think it's important that we do talk about the Murdy and Pexon article from last week, because I think it does represent a couple of things that are really worth our while. One is how they connect the theory to their hypothesis testing, right, data analysis. And the other is kind of the storytelling nature of what Murdy and Pexon are doing as they walk through their empirical analysis. And you'll see what I mean by storytelling in a few minutes. But I mean, ultimately, that is your objective as well in your data analysis memo, is to tell the story of the data analysis you conducted and the results that you obtained. And so with that said, please have the Murdy and Pexon article in front of you, but I'll also pull it up and share my screen so you can see it there. Where did it go? There it is. All right, and so what is Murdy and Pexon's research question? Again, we think about these as, reverse engineering a research design, kind of working backwards from the final product into their research design assignment, essentially, that you're putting together for your data analysis memo. So what's their research question? Yeah, Jasmine?
What explains women's non-violent protests in countries?
Good. What explains variation in women's nonviolent protest? And yeah, if you want to add in kind of the unit of analysis, you could say across countries and over time. I'm just moving you all around here a second so I can see you. Okay, good. Fantastic. So that's the research question. It identifies variation in an outcome. It also included the unit of analysis that's kind of country year, or it's country over time. Perfect. So we also note, just in terms of what we discussed on the research design assignment, right? They talk about gathering women's nonviolent protest data for the years 1991 to 2009. Right, and so that helps us to understand the scope of their study. And somewhere in here, they talk about, the range of countries that are included in their analysis, or the number of countries. That might be in the research design later. Okay, good. So that's the research question. If we come down, right, we get their basic introduction that says essentially this. There's been a ton of work on protest. There's even been work, right, on women's protest in particular, but there hasn't yet been a cross-national study, right, a study that's generalizable in scope across the world, right, across all cases, to try to understand the factors that create more and less protest among women. There have been such studies that try to assess why you have greater and lesser protest in general, but identifying women's protest as something in particular, right? They want to conduct that same kind of a study. And so I want to ask you about their dependent variable, and then we're going to talk about the theory. So what is their dependent variable, and how is it measured, right? How is it operationalized? Which is down here, right? Where they say outcome variable, women's protest activities. Can somebody just paraphrase, or summarize what you have in your notes about how that variable is measured? Connor?
So they said that there wasn't really a good existing data set for them to use. And so they kind of combined these existing ones, or it's in the first, they use the idea data set sorry, not combined. They interpreted a new coding of this existing data set.
Okay, good. And what is that existing data set composed of, or what does that coding look like?
News reporting from Reuters.
Exactly. So they have essentially newspapers. And these days, right, a lot of newspapers are online and even like cached in a repository that can be searched through like LexisNexis. Are you familiar with LexisNexis? Anybody? So it's something you have access to through the AU library. You can search it specifically, but instead of searching for scholarly articles, it searches for news items in the global press. And what they're doing here, I think this is cool, and I do stuff on events data analysis, so I just want to take a minute to talk about the dependent variable. Then we'll get into those two specific things I mentioned before. So what they do, right, is use a computer program that helps them read a whole bunch of news stories, right? And by a whole bunch, I mean like hundreds of thousands, right, of news stories from all around the world, from Reuters, which is just a news wire, right, like the Associated Press or the French press agency. They are reading Reuters newswire stories. And this computer program is going to parse out the phrases or sentences in those stories, specifically the headlines, but also the body text as well, into subject, verb, object phrases, or it's going to identify those, right? Who did what to whom? And then there's also a when and where component. So imagine a data set. Who is a subject, did what is a verb, to whom is an object, and then when and where give us some understanding of setting. Okay? And so you can think about it as a chronology, right? It's kind of what happened, who did it, who was the target of that action, when did it occur, and where did it occur. And so they essentially coded into this program the desire for specific kinds of events. They want events where the subject is women or women's specific organizations, right? Pussy Riot, Femen, right? The NOW, National Organization of Women, right? Women's organizations, or where the subject is women in particular. It says like women, right? Did something. The verb needs to be something protest oriented. Protest, strike, demonstrate, riot, march, petition, sit in, etc., etc. Strike, you know. So these are all verbs that would fall within a broad category of protest. The object then, to whom, you could leave open, right? Women do some sort of protest, period. Or you could specify that the target of that protest is, you know, some particular object like the government, right? So you might imagine a news story that says hundreds of women from Femen march in front of the Interior Ministry in Russia on June 11th, right? And of course, sometimes that's a full sentence. Sometimes, right, the time and place comes from the news story's publication date and from its location specified in the like metadata. This is about Russia, right? But otherwise, the phrase itself, who did what to whom, is you know, a full sentence that's then parsed into those three pieces: subject, verb, object. And then essentially what happens is you get a whole repository of what it says here, 114,627 Reuters reports from which they obtain this sample. Oh, I forgot. They even give the examples here. Peruvian women take to streets to reject guerrilla violence. So that would be a generic one that's not aimed at the government per se, but is a women's protest event. Okay. So then what they do to get it into a state year format, which they said is their unit of analysis is country year, is they aggregate them together to say, well, how many of these occurred in Peru in 2003 or El Salvador in 2003? If there were 12, then the number of these women's protest events is 12, and that's the variable, right? That's the data for that variable. If 8 of those 12 were focused on a government object, a government target, then for that variable, it would be 8, right? Not 12. Okay, so that's how the dependent variable is coded. It's event data, which is a particular type of data. It is a continuous variable because it's the number of something that occurred, but it's specifically a count variable, right? Because you just count it up. It's an integer. There's no ratios. There's no decimals. It's just an integer. Was there 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 12, 72 protest events in this country in this year? And it's not negative, right? And so count data we can examine or analyze with linear regression because it's a continuous variable, but it's more valid to study it with a generalized linear model called a negative binomial regression model. And so that's what they do here, okay? You're not gonna learn that in this class, that's later. If you take maximum likelihood estimation, that would be something you learn there. But the point is, it's a continuous outcome that we could study with linear regression, even though they don't, okay? Because they do it in a more valid fashion. So now let's address those two things quickly. One is, how do they connect theory to their hypothesis testing? And then how do they tell the story of their data analysis and results? So notice here that they cover why women protest, and they don't present a single theory, they present a few theories. This is uncommon, right? Generally speaking, you would cover different theories in the literature review, but then you would put forward the one theory that you're going to examine in your study. And that's what you're going to do in your data analysis memo. You're going to say, here's my hypothesis, here's the theory that kind of supports that idea, and now I'm going to analyze it quantitatively. But I just want to show you that in this one, they essentially review the literature on why people protest, and then they translate it into a hypothesis about women's protest in particular. So the first theory is relative deprivation theory, which essentially has to do with how deprived people are, how great their grievances are, you know? And it essentially says that the greater the grievances of people, the more likely they are to protest. And it comes out of social psychology, what's called the frustration aggression hypothesis. The more frustrated one is, the more aggressive their behavior, right? And so the idea is, you know, the more downtrodden or repressed or, aggrieved you are as an individual or a group is, the more likely you are to be mobilized to action, you know? And so they represent this deprivation theory as the extent to which women's rights are respected or not respected. And their hypothesis is that when women's rights are not respected, women's protest is more likely, right? So greater respect for women's rights, less protest. Less respect for women's rights, more women's protest. Okay, so that's hypothesis one. I want to just emphasize the fact that they took the theory of deprivation, and of course, as we talked about at the very beginning of the semester, had to operationalize that and make it observable and measurable. So how do you take, you know, the extent to which women are aggrieved and deprived and you know, all of that, and capture it empirically? They did it through the extent to which women's political rights and economic rights, as we'll see later, are respected by government policy or aren't, right, or government action. And they find data through the Cingranelli and Richards project on integrity, on human rights and human rights abuses across countries to measure that. All right. The next theory is resource mobilization. This one says you can be aggrieved and repressed and deprived all day long. But if you don't have resources that allow you to mobilize and coordinate and communicate with like-minded individuals, right, then you're not going to be able to muster, collective action, right? That it's not just grievance isn't enough. You can't just be pissed off. You also have to have some resources that you can draw on to actually like mobilize people into the streets or into action. And so they operationalize that in a couple of different ways that leads to different hypotheses. One of them is about organizational structure, right? Or organizational institutions as an asset. And so they say, look, there's some literature about how women's organizations become this like centerpiece and focal point for women's mobilization. So their hypothesis is that women's organizations are an asset and a resource that can be leveraged to increase coordination and communication. Whoa, I almost fell out of my chair. I'm excited. Coordination and communication among women to, take action. That did one of those like heart jump things. It's like in my neck. The second one, and they discuss here in theoretical terms, the role of education, right? Focusing specifically on the role of education in women's collective action. Many studies, explain the rise of women's movements in terms of their growing educational attainment. So that's their theory. The hypothesis is that when women are better educated in a society, their nonviolent protest is more likely. Okay, interesting hypothesis. Who knows if it's borne out or not? And then the last one is about the level of development of the country. Essentially, do you have roads? Do you have internet infrastructure? Do you have saturation of cell phones and things like that? Those are all assets and resources. Okay. The last theory is political process theory, also called political opportunity structure. And this is a structural aspect, right? It says that you can be aggrieved all day long and frustrated and deprived, and you can have resources that you can mobilize to, bring people out. But is the system open to your activism or not? If you and 10 of your friends go out to demonstrate on the side of the road and the government rolls up in force and beats you down, then the system is not open to your expression, right? Or if, right, you see in Myanmar today or in, lots of other places, right, where repression is particularly high, it means that the political system is not open to forms of public expression, right? People are just shot dead in the street, frankly, sometimes for their collective action. And so to what extent is the system open? Generally, we measure that in terms of democracy, right? How open is the political system? So they say political openness has an inverted U-shape, curvilinear relationship. What that means, just so we don't skip past it without dealing with it, what that means quickly, can you see this whiteboard? No, let me change it real quick. What that means is, right, an inverted U, and we may next week talk about doing this kind of a study, but an inverted U says, right, this. And so if we have like democracy or openness, I should say, it's political openness on the x-axis, and this is protest on the y-axis, what they're saying is that in this area here, on the low areas of political openness, right, and at the high areas of political openness, then you're very unlikely to see high levels of protest. Why? Because this one is the one where you're shot dead if you come out into the street. And this one over here is the one where you have institutional channels through which you can get your grievances redressed, right? You're supposed to be able to reach out to your homeowners association or your school board or your local politicians or your national legislature, whatever it is, to get your problems dealt with. And so protest is less likely there. And it's really in that middle section here right? It's in this middle range of political openness that you have high levels, the high levels of political protest. Okay, so so that's that. So that's that's the way that they're, essentially talking through their theories and then translating them into hypotheses by operationalizing their variables. Okay, they talk all about those in detail here as covariates of women's protest, meaning independent and control variables, right? Right-hand side of the equation variables that help to explain women's protest. So I would just suggest you go back through and just familiarize yourself with how they operationalize some of them and why they say it makes sense. On that educational one, they include female tertiary education, the percentage of tertiary students that are women. We gathered this data from UNESCO, cross-national database. And so, right, this is the kind of information you want to provide in your data analysis memo and your research design. You would want to go a little bit further to say, what's the range of values of that variable, right? Is it 0 to 100? Yes, because it's a percentage. So it's a 0 to 100%. Maybe that's obvious given that it's percentage, but, try to just be specific about where is the data coming from? How is it coded? How is it measured? What are the range of values it can take on, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I won't go through the rest. Lastly, let's just talk about their results. Okay, how do they tell the story of their data analysis and their findings? Well, the first thing that they do, right, is provide a regression table. Take a quick look at that and then tell me what you see the authors doing across these 5 models. What are they trying to convey? Jasmine?
In presenting the independent variables individually, at first, I think they're accounting for collinearity, and then they're saying that each of these variables are either statistically significant or statistically insignificant, independent of one another. And then in the 5th model, they just show them all together in relation to the dependent variable of general protests in a country.
Okay, great. So they are presenting 5 separate models. They're all really similar models in that they have the same control variables accounted for in each one, right? They're controlling for GDP per capita. They're controlling for past protest events, right? You figure women's protest last year is correlated with the amount of women's protest this year. So they're including that. They're including female population and the percentage of women that make up the population. You figure more women's protest, so they're controlling for that. And so these are all things that they're considering as control variables, you'll remember from multivariate regression, alongside what Jasmine said are individual tests, right? So they're all multivariate, but model 1 is multivariate, examining that first hypothesis about women's repression, women's political rights. And then the second one, the second model, is also about that first hypothesis, but it's on women's economic rights and the extent to which those are respected or not. So they split that hypothesis into 2 different operational indicators of respect for women's rights or repression, one political, one economic, right? Model 3 then does that women's education as an asset or a resource for the resource mobilization theory. Notice that that one is not statistically significant. I'll come back and we'll ask about actually the results in a second. But anyway, so they cover that one, again, keeping the controls. The 4th model then does the women's NGOs as a resource, right? And so that's captured there. In each of these, they're also including, for example, the political opportunity structure, theory with democracy and democracy squared. So they don't do that one separately because they figured that's a context variable that they need to include in all models. But nonetheless, Jasmine's right. They're going to walk through each hypothesis, most of each of the hypotheses, as a separate model, right? Still controlling for this main set of controls. And then at the end, they're going to, so these are kind of like bivariate tests, but they are multivariate in the sense that you're controlling for other things, but they're wanting to highlight each of their main variables for each hypothesis separately. And then in the last model, as Jasmine mentioned, right, they're putting them all together to see, is there, when we include them in the same model, right, we are allowing for some degree of multicollinearity to exist across these different variables, right? They might have redundancy in their explanation of women's protest, right? They might inform each other and therefore their explanatory value goes down when they're in the same model. And so they're trying to show you that even when you put all of them together in the same model, they're still each explanatory, right? Or this, the ones that were statistically significant before are still statistically significant when they're all together in the same model. Okay. Now, if these were, let's just say a couple of other things. Let's just pretend for a second that this was a linear regression model and we could interpret these beta coefficients. Let's look at model 5. How would we interpret the beta coefficients for these few variables here? You know, women's political rights, economic rights, tertiary education, and women's NGOs. Let's just practice that really quickly. If these were beta coefficients in a linear model, what would you say to interpret them statistically and substantively? Yeah, Jasmine, take it away.
Substantially for the first one, I would say for every 1 unit increase in, I'm sorry, for every 1 unit increase in women's political rights, there's a 0.266 decrease in, would it be the likelihood of women's protest or just women's protest?
In women's protest, however it's measured, and in this case, it's protest events, right? Remember, it's a continuous count variable. So it'd be, go ahead. So it'd be a 0.266 decrease in?
The amount of women's protests.
That's right, in women's protest events. Great. And so that's perfect. So I think we can just take that as being representative of what we would do for the rest, right? A 1 unit increase in women's economic rights really produces, right, or is associated with a 0.159 reduction in women's protest events. We would say then for female tertiary education that that is not statistically significant, and therefore, right, the effect of female tertiary education on women's protest, or the relationship between the two, is no different than 0. So this came up yesterday, and I just want to make sure that it's clear. When you have a result that is not statistically significant, then it means whatever number you got for your coefficient, or whatever, if you do a difference of means test, whatever difference you have in the means, or if you're doing an analysis of variance, whatever difference you have in the means across categories, or in crosstabs, whatever difference you see in the percentages or the rate across categories. Whatever difference you actually do observe or amount of relationship you see in the beta coefficient or in a correlation If you don't have statistical significance, then that relationship or association or coefficient or difference might as well be 0. We don't have enough evidence to say that it's not 0. And so we stick with the null hypothesis that it is no different than 0. Okay, so keep that in mind. We can still interpret substantive effects when we don't have statistical significance, but it's always the same answer. If we don't have statistical significance, then the substantive effect is no different than 0. Right? Or there isn't a substantive effect because we don't have enough evidence to support one. Okay, but don't just not say anything about it, right? Simply say that there isn't, a substantive effect of one on the other. Very good. So then the last two things here. My one question is going to be, how is this table, table number 1, different than table number 3? And then the other one is, what's going on in table 2, which is the same as what's happening in table 4. So let's just focus on table 2. Okay? So how is table 1 and table 3, how are they different from each other? I mean, they look pretty much the same, right? Model 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Jacob?
Their dependent variable is different. For the third one, it says that for table 3, their dependent variable is count of anti-state women's protest. And then for the first table, their dependent variable is count of all women's protests.
Perfect. So they have operationalized their dependent variable in 2 different ways as well to examine the robustness of their findings. What I mean by that is they wanted to know, do our results change when we examine women's protest writ large versus when we examine women's protest specifically targeting the government? Right? And they discuss that in the text a little bit, why that's important for them to kind of shake out. And what I want to say about that is, in your data analysis memo, and I'm going to give you more examples of this, including about the Ross reading for today. I've recorded a little something that I'll share with you about empirical richness in your data analysis memo. So if you look at the handout, for the instruction sheet, I should say, for your data analysis memo, you will see, right, for the data analysis memo, you will see this middle section here. I'm highlighting this, yeah, you can see, okay? This middle section here says you can do these things at minimum, do descriptive stats, a bivariate test, a multivariate test, and that's great, but that's not enough if you want the, if you want the A. You can do that in a fantastic fashion, but you need to do something more if you want to make yourself eligible for an A. Doing more doesn't guarantee you an A, certainly, but if you want to be eligible for an A for the data analysis memo, I want you to go one step further. And I give you some examples on how you might do that. Notice one of those examples is what Murdy and Pexon do here. They operationalize their dependent variable in 2 different ways. Notice they did a number of other things too, like operationalizing their repression independent variable in terms of political repression and also economic repression. So they operationalized that in 2 different ways. They also had more than one hypothesis. So if you wanted a second hypothesis, that could also be a way to obtain empirical richness. I'll talk to you in the Ross article about how he examined outliers, which we practiced in Practice Problems 4 last week. You might remember we found an outlier that was really extreme, the United States on its trade balance. And so we examined a model with the United States included, and then a model that excluded the United States to see if the United States was driving our original results, that such that when we take it out, we got, do we get different ones or not? So that's another opportunity. There are other ways, and we'll talk more about it. I don't want to take any more of class time on this, but that's what I mean in your data analysis memo, which is also included in your research design assignment, right? At the very end. Are you looking at this, or I'm not showing it to you? The research design assignment? Yeah, at the very end where I talk about analytical wrinkle complication or richness. This is, put something else in there beyond the descriptive statistics, bivariate statistics, and multivariate statistics, or bivariate test, multivariate test. Do one more thing, and there's lots of cool ways to do that based on whatever data that you have. Great. Now, just to wrap up on Murdy and Pexon, and then we'll have 15 or 16 minutes left, is, if I can find Murdy and Pexon again, is this last bit here, table 2 and also table 4. What are we looking at here? Keep in mind that the coefficients we were just interpreting above were wrong, right? Or we weren't doing it correctly because those are not linear regression beta coefficients. So we really couldn't interpret them in the way we did, right? That a 1 unit increase in women's political rights leads to a 0.266 decrease in women's protests, because these are negative binomial regression equation coefficients, which is, let's say, similar to logistic regression in the sense that we can't interpret them directly. Just like you learn in logistic regression, right? Also in negative binomial regression models, the line curves, right? Our best fit line is not a straight one with a constant slope coefficient. It bends according to the distribution of our data. But it doesn't bend as an S like logistic regression. It bends a little bit differently, kind of like a really steep hill with a long tail. Because count data generally follows that kind of a distribution. And so we're using a different underlying distribution than a straight line or an S curve. Now we're using a steep hill, okay? But with that said, we'll go back to table 2. What are they doing in table 2 now that I've given that preface? Shannon.
They're evaluating how the variables change when the number of women's protest activities is at the minimum and maximum value.
Awesome. So they're doing marginal effects or substantive effects. Just like in logistic regression, where you're saying, what's the predicted probability at different levels of X, right? Or just like in problem set 2, where you said, not just for a 1 unit change or increase in X, what is the corresponding change in Y? But I think I asked you, what is the change in troops for a 10,000 increase in refugees? What is the change in troops we would estimate from our model for an interquartile range increase? What's the estimated change in troops for a standard deviation increase in refugees? We could have also asked in the problem set, what is the change in troops for a minimum to maximum increase in refugees? And that's what they're doing here. They're saying, what is the change in the predicted number of events when the independent variable listed here goes from its minimum value to its maximum value, right? So when women's political rights goes from its minimum to its maximum, we expect 1 fewer event in a country year. Women's economic rights, half an event less. Women's NGOs, 13 additional events, right? Now, the very last thing I'll just say about this is it would be really helpful if Murdy and Pexon gave us a table of their descriptive statistics. Because we can really only know really well, or I think we can only really interpret this table well, if we know what is the central tendency and range and dispersion of Protest, women's protest, right? What constitutes a lot of events or a few events? What's the mean number of events, right? Across country years, et cetera. It would also be helpful to know the descriptive statistics, the same ones for the independent variables as well, right? If women's political rights can only go from 0 to 5, then a one event reduction, may actually matter. But if it goes from, well, I mean, it just depends, right? What the values of the variables are, right? If women's NGOs, most women's NGOs, let's say based on the mean or median, is 7 women's NGOs in a country, but in the maximum there's 3,752 women's NGOs, then going from 0 to 3,752 is a rather extreme leap when, generally speaking, most countries only have 7, right? So we really want to know the underlying descriptive statistics in order to best judge these substantive effects. That's just kind of a quick appeal that you think about your marginal effects or your substantive effects in relation to the descriptive statistics of your variables. What's their median and mean, so we know the central tendency? What's their range? What's their dispersion? Based on that, you can better interpret your substantive effects, whether it's from a beta coefficient or a predicted probability or a difference in the means or a difference in the rate from a cross tabulation or whatever it is. Okay, so that's Murdy and Pexon. I hope there were some takeaways there that directly inform your data analysis memo. What questions do you have about problem set 3 or anything else? I didn't give us a ton of time, but there's time.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead. All right, so Adrian, then Shannon, and then if anybody else wants to jump in, that's good.
So reading through all of this and looking for a data set for the research project or for the memo, and also the work that I've done in like indices and stuff in the past, I really worry about like there's just with quantitative evidence, it's so easy to manipulate data because so few people can understand what all the numbers mean, but also looking through all these data sets, like there are thousands of values and we don't know anything more about it except that number. And so is there like in terms of, and I'm sure that there is, I was thinking like that with the state year data sets that we're looking at, is there like a resource or do the authors or whoever is responsible for collecting the data, is there information on how it's collected or where it comes from or who does it or how it happens?
Generally, yes. Otherwise, like it would be a faux pas to use it, right? If you don't know where it comes from, what its coding rules are, what the process was of data collection, et cetera. And so a couple of things. Number one, if it comes from a data project, then the data project website will really go through that in great detail. So one of them we saw before, and the one that I use in the merging data tutorial with Murdy and Pexon is VDEM's measure of women's rights. It's called VDEM gender. And so you'll see that essentially I say, if you'll just give me a second, I say for this merging process, let's imagine that we want to retest Murdy and Pexon's hypothesis 1. But we don't want to use the Cingranelli and Richards data that she did. Sorry if I'm giving you vertigo here. Maybe we don't want to use the Cingranelli and Richards human rights data set. If we go to the website for the SIRI data set and we see that, well, it's suboptimal in some way, or we don't like its coding or something like that, we might find another one through the VDEM project. We can go to the VDEM project, find the VDEM gender variable, understand how it's coded, which comes from essentially expert surveys that are weighted in different ways and all sorts of things. And then we can bring that data, that variable, into the Murdy and Pexon data set and simply retest their hypothesis with that variable instead of this one, right? Women's political or economic rights. I know that was a slight side note, but I just wanted to kind of preview that. So what we would do though is read the article itself, see where the data came from, go to the source, right? This is like the Keanu Reeves in The Matrix, right? Have you seen that meme? It says like, go to the source. Maybe not. I won't quit my day job, but it says go to the source, right? And so the idea is go to the source and read about the data project and its data collection process and the coding rules and all of that. The other main place where we find that stuff is in the code book for a data set itself, right? Murdy and Pexon might provide a code book for the data in here, or they might figure, look, we tell you where we got it all from. None of it's new except for the dependent variable, which we tell you about in some significant detail. If you want to know more about it, you can look up the IDEA coding framework, which does exist online. It's got kind of underlying libraries of proper nouns that attach those things to different subjects and object categories and stuff like that. So, I mean, you can dive in and look at it. So I would say either code book or go to the source. But no matter what, any data that you're obtaining, if it's acceptable to use, is going to tell you where the data comes from at the very least, if not also kind of repeat for you what the details are of its coding. Shannon.
Okay, I have two questions. One is pretty short. The other one might not be as short. My first question is, do you have a preference for how many decimal points we use?
Yeah, so 2 critical values is what I generally say. It's a good rule of thumb. What that means is, and in fact, so I know this was forever ago. I think on like day 2 or 3, maybe right around the problem set 1, I talked about this a little bit. Again, I don't expect anybody would remember that. But what that means is, let's say a number is pi, 3.1415926, whatever it is. Then it would be 3.14, right? But let's say you have a number like, 0.0178, then I would want 0.018. You need to go out the zeros until you get to 2 real values. I said critical values, I meant real values, non-zero values. Unless it's a p-value, and then you just do p is less than whatever.
Okay.
Right, so it's p is 0.000, then it's p is less than 0.001.
Okay. And then my second question is, I know that you don't want like the kind of 1980s style tables from Stata in our problem sets. What about scatter plots? Or is there a way to make those like prettier or nicer? I tried to use them with the commands from your Making Nice table tutorials. I found out that only works with tables, not scatter plots. So is there some place we should be? Are you expecting that or?
No, I'm not, but does anybody else care about this? Okay. Well, I just wanted to know, because otherwise I'd say, Shannon, let's just have office hours or something. But sorry, hopefully that was not, I was not meant to be rude. I just wanted to know if anybody else wanted to hear me talk about it. I'll show you just really quickly. Let's do a scatter plot. Pick 2 variables that are both continuous from the state your data set. Let's do like telephones per 100. By the way, I don't know if you knew this, and it's not a great thing to do, but you don't have to write out a full variable name. You just have to go out as far as it is necessary to make it distinct. So if I write like democ, it won't work. Well, first of all, I need more than one variable there, but democ is ambiguous because there's more than 2 variables that start with democ. But if I wanted democ score, I could just do democ S and it would do the democ score variable. Or if I wanted democracy, I could just do that. I don't really like that practice, because what if I had a variable later called something else that might then get confused, right? If instead of Demox score, I did like Demox score 2, or Demox awesome, or Demox something with an S. Then I'd have to go back and change my entire do files that I've ever written to correspond to this data set, because it would be an ambiguous abbreviation at that point. So, but just so you know. But let's do scatter, telephones, and health expenditures. Yeah. I'm going to make it a little cleaner. Okay, so here's a scatter plot. If you want to do this manually, okay, you can just click this little guy up here, this little pencil over the graph, and then you can choose different components of the graph to change. So if you don't like this as the label, right, you can come up here and change the label. Telephones per 100. Maybe we just want to keep it like that and not include the World Bank's code, which is what that comes from, right? And so we hit enter, and now it changes that. Maybe we don't want it so I just double clicked. Maybe we don't want it so big. Maybe we want it smaller, right? And so we can go from medium small and make it, and make it very small. Okay, and you could do the same on the y-axis. You can change this, this robin's egg blue, or whatever you want to call it, light bluish gray, and you could make it, ugly, like purple, or you could do grayscales, which might be nicer than the blue if you wanted to do grayscale or something like that. You can change these, right? So if I double click on the actual plot observations, right, you can change these from circles to, you see a lot of times in my lectures and stuff, I'll do hollow, right? So hollow circle or hollow small circle, hollow circle. We can apply that. You can change the color of that from navy to, maybe you want that to be, maroon. Okay. And so, you can change the look and feel of your graphs. You can do the same in box plots and, bar charts and other things. In order to get this out, then you do just like we've seen before, save as, make it a PNG or a JPEG, and then it'll save it on your computer, and you can just pull that into your Word file. The last thing I'll just tell you is there are schemes in Stata. Some of them come pre-packaged. Most of the ones I like to use, you add on, so you can just look them up online. If you're interested in more information, since we're almost out of time, just post this in the forum. Can you tell me more about putting schemes in Stata? And I'll give you more information. But we could do the same scatter plot, and as an option, do a scheme. And when you see in my, in some of my stuff, it'll look kind of like a black and white or grayscale kind of thing. I use like the lean to, and so that's nice, kind of black and white. You can do bird. Bird is a good set of schemes. I think there are 4 of them. I don't remember which is which, but let's do this one. Yeah, that's not one. But these are good ones, actually. If I did a line of best fit really quickly, right? This is where it looks nice. Fit, telephone, health exp, share, GDP. Well, that's not one of the better ones. Normally it'll put like a kind of orangish red line in there somewhere if you do one of the other birds. It'll change the legend, it'll give you like a different legend look. That's not one. Anyway, I haven't used the bird ones in a while, but lean 1, lean 2. I'll give you one other really quickly though that some people like. I find it ugly, but it has a built-in one in Stata that looks like the Economist magazine, right? So you get that kind of a look to it. This is where you can also add and edit titles and stuff like that. So that's more than you bargained for probably, but those are some options. And then just the final note on that is you can also, if you really want to dive into it, and you could probably find PDF a PDF of this online, or maybe some instructions that follow it. But there is a design, like a Stata graphics handbook. It's called A Visual Guide to Stata Graphics. It's more extensive than you would ever want. But what it shows you is how you could essentially manipulate all of those things, the entire look and feel, which is how these schemes are made in the first place, by the way, with syntax. Typing in what you want your labels to be, I mean, some of you have seen me do this before, where I would do something like, where I would do, can I do it like this? Right, where, well, let me take off econ. Where if you do M label for another variable in the data set, like we have the state variable that has country names. Let me stick to lean and see if it does it. Right, then you can essentially put the names of countries in there, which of course is very messy, but you can, you could limit it or change it in some ways. So anyway, you can code that all out and not do it with the point and click approach, but that's if you really want to go to, crazy town with it. Okay, well, we're a few minutes after, and so with that, I'm happy to take any other questions you have in the discussion forum about any of these things, or problem set 3 or anything else. Please do limit any correspondence or interaction that you have about the problem set to the forum. I think everybody is abiding by that, as they should be, but I have a couple of indications when I look at some of your syntax for the problem sets or other things where there have been just a couple of very minor incidents where it just makes me feel like there's kind of behind the scenes collaboration going on. And I try to make collaboration very possible and welcome it with the forum. And so that's where I prefer it to take place, because it might as well be a communal thing for everybody, and make sure that it's all above board and happening in the appropriate way. So please make sure that's where you direct your questions. Otherwise, have a really, really great week, and I'll see you in office hours or the discussion forum or next Wednesday. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Welcome. Bye-bye.